Hi, everybody. Hopefully, everybody can hear me. Feel free to say hello in the chat bar. Hello. My name is Emann, and I'm going to be running the Mental Threats webinar. How are we all doing? Feel free to give us a rating of how you're doing. Morning, Sue, from lockdown, New Zealand. Oh, I'm sorry. Hopefully, you'll get past that soon. In light of that, hi, Kimberly from Noosa. I've been up to Noosa. It's a lovely place. Jacqueline, Ira from Melbourne. Hello. Yes, it really is, Teresa. Eliza from Sydney. Yes, I'm from Sydney. Alan from Perth. Feeling good. On a scale of 1 to 5, how are you all going? 1 being not so good, 5 being great. Raymond from Sydney. Jessica from the Central Coast. 4. All right. 3, 4. Mandy from Brisbane, feeling great. Okay. Well, let's see if we can get the 3. Oh, probably a 7. Okay, that surpassed the actual sort of scale. Great. Okay. So hopefully, because the scale was from 1 to 5. So hopefully, maybe we can get those 3s out of 5s to something a bit higher by the end of the day. All right, Eliza. 2.5, 3.5. Okay. All right. Well, let's see how it can go. So, we've done this part of the webinar, which is good, and hopefully we can sort of get a bit of a shift towards the end of the webinar. So firstly, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands upon which we meet today and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. And I'd also like to acknowledge that I'm here today on the land of the traditional owners of this land, the Darug and Eora people. And I'd also like to extend my respect and acknowledgement to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are here with us today. All right, so I'm Emann. I'm a provisional psychologist and I'm also a coach. So a coach is someone that provides, a service for people that are experiencing some difficulties with stress, work-related stress, for instance, a bit of anxiety, a bit of depression, for instance. So this service is not just for those that are feeling really mentally down, but also for people that are doing well, but that would just like some work-related sort of support. And it's for free if Uprise is your EAP. All right. So feel free to post your questions in the chat. We may have time towards the end to get to some of your questions. We'll also have a feedback form for you guys to fill out and the opportunity for you to get a recording of this webinar. Hopefully. I won't be checking the chat throughout the webinar to answer questions, but hopefully towards the end we'll get the chance to have a look at any questions that you might have. All right, so to begin with, what I wanted to do is just to talk about the brain, just to give you guys a bit of a foundational understanding of the brain. And once we have a foundational understanding of the brain, that's when we'll be in a better position to be able to help and to support ourselves. So the brain is essentially constituted of 3 parts. So you've got the part of the brain, the spinal cord, and the brainstem that's responsible for sleep, wake, so activities. It's responsible for regulating your breathing, essentially keeping you alive. Then on top of that, you've got a part of the brain that's about 200 million years old, and it's called the limbic brain, and that's essentially responsible for, it's called the security guard part of the brain, and that's basically responsible for keeping you alive. So anything that's good must be gotten, and anything that's going to compromise on your ability to be safe, anything that's dangerous must be avoided or killed off. And that's what the limbic part of the brain, or the security guard part of the brain, is responsible for. Then you've got the neocortex. So this is about 100 million years old. And this part of the brain is responsible for marrying ideas together, for looking at long-term and short-term perspectives. It's responsible for decision-making and for planning, for instance. And essentially, it's what we call the CEO part of the brain. Now, the CEO part of the brain and the security guard part of the brain are very much responsible. They're communicating with each other, and they typically agree with each other. Now, during the caveman times, that security guard part of the brain was very important in actually sort of keeping us alive. So if there were tribal wars, predation, for instance, bad weather, that security guard part of the brain is very much responsible essentially for keeping us alive and protecting us from all of those things. Now, as we progress down the evolutionary line, the security guard part of the brain became very important for safety. So anything that's good for us, that facilitates our survival, so food, intimacy, belonging, that needs to be gotten. That's the role of the security guard part of the brain, to constantly scan the environment to see how we can actually have access to that. But it also scans the environment to protect us from any danger that might be within the environment, so any physical threats. And it does this because it has connections with our hormonal system. So it scans the environment, it's got connections with our hormonal system, and then whenever there's threat in our environment, there's a cascade of hormones that get sent to different parts of the body, essentially, in order to actually sort of protect us from that danger. Now, when things are calm and good, our brain sort of senses that, and then it also sends hormones such as oxytocin and serotonin to different parts of the body to tell us that things are calm, good, there aren't any threats, and things need to be kept in the way that they're actually sort of kept in. So security guard part of the brain, that primitive part of the brain, is very important for our survival. Now, when does that particular aspect or way of being that the security guard part of the brain has, that's fighting or flying away from danger, when does that actually become a problem? It's very useful. It's a very useful approach to have when it comes to physical threats, when it comes to caveman times. But when it comes to mental threats, it's actually a problematic approach. And the reason as to why it's a problematic approach is because most of the threats that we experience in the 21st century in WEIRD countries, so westernized, educated, industrialized, rich developed countries, most of those threats are to our social status. Most of those threats are to our relationships, to our work, for instance. They're not, or essentially many of those threats are imagined threats about our social status, about something compromising our reputation, about something compromising our jobs, for instance. Most of those threats are not necessarily physical in nature, or dare I say, real in nature. So many of the threats are mental, they're generated, they're made up, they're imagined. And you recognize that when you start to have thoughts like, for instance, what if I lose my job? For instance, what if I get sick? I'll be reliant on the government for the rest of my life. So that's the story, that's the mental threat that you start to create, that security guard part of the brain is responding to. And sometimes it can be something quite positive. So it might be, but you still get agitated as a consequence of that positive thought. So it might be something like, oh, if I have a big enough house, then I'll feel safe enough. Or then I'm going to be sort of, if I have a big enough house, then I'm going to be able to sort of marry well and provide for my family. And if I don't get that, then I'm going to sort of be in a state of ruin, for instance. Okay. So usually when it comes to problem solving, the neocortex, right, so that is able to handle that situation quite well, right? But sometimes when the neocortex is not able to problem solve, the security guard part of the brain actually sort of takes over and it tries to control the situation, okay? So what it does is it tries to build more and more fences around a fortress. So in order to try and ward off danger as much as possible. And it's operating in simple terms through that fight and flight sort of system. So when it comes to danger, you're doing what you can in order to get rid of the danger. So it's very much the squirrel collecting as many acorns as it can for the coming winter, right? And usually the CEO part of the brain agrees with this particular approach. So when there's a problem, for instance, your car is stuck, you're worried about being reprimanded by your boss. So what do? You call the NRMA, for instance, or you screw that and you just catch an Uber, leave the car where it is, fly off to work and then deal with it later, right? So that's the security guard part of the brain helping you figure out what to do in that particular, it's responding to that physical threat. Or say, for instance, you've got a broken leg, you get the leg plastered, you call the physio, later down the track in 6 months' time, you do the physio exercises. Prior to that, you're at the hospital, you're speaking to the doctor. You're getting what you need to get done in order to solve the real physical threat within the situation. Okay, so that's a really good way of dealing with things when it comes to sort of physical threats. But when it comes to our mental threats, essentially the what ifs of life, it's not a very good way of dealing with particular issues. And there's a bit of neurobiology behind that. So you've got the security guard part of the brain. It's somewhat primitive and it's connected to our senses and our motor skills, right? So it pretty much has very much a shoot first, ask questions later approach. So the security guard part of the brain sees, it essentially sort of gets you to scan your environment, and then all of a sudden you move out of the way of a speeding car, for instance, that comes out of the corner. And the reason why it's actually able to do that is because it's scanning any physical threats in the environment, it's connected to your senses and your motor skills, and it gets you to protect yourself as quickly and as soon as possible, right? So that technique is very good in actually sort of keeping us safe and controlling the situation. And it's there for very good reason. Or for instance, you're walking and then you straight away move out of the way because your security guard part of the brain has sensed that there's a spider web, for instance, hanging from a tree. And then your CEO's part of the brain is the one moments later that's saying, God, what just happened? So that's the CEO part of your brain essentially sort of kicking in that particular sort of circumstances, right? So as I said, when it comes to mental threats, that particular shoot first, ask questions later isn't the best approach, okay? So, and the security guard part of the brain uses the same technique to physical threats as it does to mental threats, and then it tries to control things. And then it hijacks your thinking, for instance. It hijacks your normal thinking and your actions. And then that's when you start to get involved in really impulsive acting. So you start to think, I'm stressed. I'm going to down a bottle of wine, for instance, to get rid of the stress. That's the security guard part of the brain talking. Or for instance, my boss has annoyed me. I'm going to yell at my boss. That's the security guard part of your brain urging you to actually sort of do that, even though you know at a neocortical sort of prefrontal cortex level, in terms of planning and decision making, that's actually a bad idea, that you don't want to be yelling at your boss or your spouse or whoever it actually might be. So that's the shoot first, asking questions sort of later approach. And you might actually sort of see it, for instance, when you all of a sudden find yourself getting caught into sort of particular sort of habits and you feel like you don't really have control over your behavior anymore. So for instance, you can see it with procrastination. So it might be that, there's a particular sort of task that you need to do, a project, a set of assignments, or getting ready for exams. The security guard part of your brain essentially sees that exam or that assessment as a threat, or that particular work project as a threat. You say, oh my God, I need to do that. I'm not going to be able to finish it. It's going to be completely overwhelming. It's going to drain me. You see it as a threat. And so if you're obeying the security guard part of your brain, you do what you can in order to avoid that threat. So what do? You operate through fight and flight or freeze. You might sort of jump into bed and get yourself under the covers, for instance, or you might sort of just hop onto Netflix and avoid it, right? So that's a security guard part of your brain getting you to sort of think and to operate and to function. And all the same time, you're going, oh God, what on earth am I doing? What on earth am I doing? That's a neocortex. But you're not able to sort of listen to the neocortex part of the brain because you're so used to and you're so automated and responding and to the security guard part of the brain without sort of taking a few steps back and really sort of trying to diffuse from that particular sort of threat that you've created that has become part of your reality. That process is very difficult. So you get sort of stuck in this sort of vicious cycle of behaving in a way in which you probably wouldn't sort of prefer. Now, where does this problem actually come from, right? So the problem in terms of our mental threats comes from the fact that we've learnt to actually, characterize a lot of these threats using particular sort of stories, and that are essentially constituted of thoughts that are essentially sort of constituted of words, right? So the reason why we're so easily able to see our problems in the form of mental threats is because we've learnt to use words in order to describe everything. Okay, so we use words in order to describe emotions, events, thoughts, absolutely everything. Now, these internal words, they're thoughts that are rambling through our brain at lightning speed, and they constitute the stories that we tell us. And it's these stories that are essentially mental threats. And it's these stories that are essentially eliciting particular sort of pictures and images within our brains that then create, through our hormonal systems, particular physical sensations within our body. Okay? So if you've ever tried to get rid of a bad feeling, you're not able to do so, right? So if it's very similar to, for instance, if you're trying to control your thinking and you say to yourself, okay, so I shouldn't think about this, I shouldn't think about this, I need to forget about this thing or this image that's come to mind that I'm going to lose my house, I'm going to lose my job, for instance. So that's the negative automatic thought, that's the mental threat that's essentially sort of come up, and your security guard part of the brain is essentially responding to that threat by getting you to suppress the thought, by getting rid of it, by avoiding it, in the same way that it tries to get you to respond to physical threats, avoiding the spider web, avoiding the moving car. It's very similar to someone putting a gun to your head and saying, you mustn't be afraid, otherwise I'm going to shoot. And if you get afraid, then I'm going to shoot. So naturally, you're going to be afraid in response to that. It's a very normal reaction. So your security guard part of the brain sees the mental threat and it essentially gets afraid in response to the mental threat. And it essentially sort of rambles on and tries to get you to forget or to suppress your actual sort of thinking. So the two reactions are very much the same. Well, they're very sort of similar. Okay, so I'm essentially, there's this idea of, you're going to be afraid. The mental threat is that the security guard part of the brain is actually sort of seeing it, and it's responding to it by essentially sort of being afraid, the exact opposite reaction that you actually sort of need in that sort of circumstances, that sort of shooting sort of response. And that's digging the hole further in the sand as opposed to sort of alleviating it. There's this belief that the more you think about it, the more that you're going to be able to solve the problem. But the more that you think about it, it's similar to digging a hole in the sand, and it's actually extending and prolonging your emotional distress. It's actually not relieving it. But that's what the security guard part of the brain is doing. It's thinking more, it's ruminating more in order to alleviate that distress, but it's not actually relieving it. Okay? So what do you do about the fact that you actually assign meaning to words? Now, here's a quick lesson in Levantine Arabic. You can use whatever language that you don't know in order to illustrate this point to yourself. So Greek, Italian, Mexican, French, for instance, but I'm using Levantine Arabic because it's the only language that I actually know to demonstrate this point. And it's probably a language that some people might not know. Okay, so if we can sort of think about the word hub in Arabic, right? So the word hub in Arabic means love, and the word ikrah in Arabic actually means hate. Now, if you don't know Arabic, you don't know what these words actually mean before I told you, right? So the words hub and ikrah, which has been spelled incorrectly there actually. So if you don't speak Arabic, you don't really know the meaning to them. But that's exactly what our brain does. It assigns meaning to words, and those words start to represent the actual event, regardless of whether the event is actually sort of taking place. So by thinking of the context of the word, you start to see it as a mental threat, and your brain gets a reaction. And then it sends a message through your hormonal systems, it gets everything upset, and your brain starts to ramble on. So given this example, what is it that you need to do? And given the fact that words form thoughts, that form stories, and it's the meaning that we're assigning to those particular words that are creating the mental threats, what do we need to do? We need to stop assigning meaning to words. So you make the words less important. You take them less seriously. It's not that you completely ignore them, right? But you want to place less emphasis on those words that are essentially rambling through your head, that the security guard part of the brain starts responding to and makes it really sort of angry. Okay? So most thoughts are essentially sort of stories, okay? So they're opinions, beliefs, ideas, models, biases, attitudes. Some are factual, some are not. Some are about you, me, the past, the present, the future, okay? So, but a lot of the times they don't necessarily have much to do with our actual reality, okay? So a lot of these stories are pretend. They're not necessarily real, they're imagined. But we've learned we're not able to actually diffuse ourselves or separate ourselves from reality and these particular sort of stories that we've made up. So we say to ourselves, in 5 years' time, if I don't have A, B, and C, then I'm going to be screwed and stuffed up. I'm not going to be set for life, for instance. So what do we need to do? So the idea is that we've assigned a lot of truth to these particular sort of words, and we're very much fused with these particular stories. Our realities are fused with these particular sort of stories. So now, because words in and of themselves have meaning, right? Just saying these words can have a lot of power. So you need to understand that whatever words you actually sort of place on your tongue, those words actually have a lot of power. So if you say to yourself, I'm a failure, that's going to produce particular meanings and particular effects on the body because of the word, because of the meaning attached to the word hopeless, or I'm a failure, or I'm bad, for instance. You're going to feel really bad as a consequence. If you say, for instance, I'm lovable or I'm awesome, then that may cause you to feel really good. Okay, but sort of it depends. Sometimes if you don't believe it, it's not going to have that particular impact. But I think it's important to remember that what you place on your tongue is really sort of powerful, because it can directly impact how the reality that you actually sort of end up perceiving and believing and then responding to emotionally. Okay, so what do? So there are 4 techniques that you can try. So one of the first things that you can actually sort of do to diffuse from this story that you've created, that you've merged with your reality, is to use the sentence, I'm having the thought that, or the phrase, I'm having the thought that I'm not good enough, whenever the I'm not good enough thought comes up. Or I'm having the feeling or the emotion that I'm sad, for instance. And what that actually sort of does, when you sort of stick that particular phrasing in front of the thoughts that you're having, it allows you to start to diffuse from the particular thought. So you start to separate from that particular thought, and then you realize that your thoughts are just thoughts. They're just thoughts that are spinning through a radio channel in your actual sort of head, and they're not necessarily true. The second thing that you can try is having an attitude of gratitude approach. So for instance, it might be that you're having the I'm not good enough thought. Okay, thanks, mind. So it's a very frivolous, I know, but also a humorous way of kind of loosening up the energy around that particular sort of thought that's come up. Okay, thanks, mind. I'm having the I'm not good enough sort of thought today, or I'm a failure, or I'm not a good friend sort of thought today. Okay, so thank you very much for that input, mind. It's no different to I'm a failure is no different to I'm a strawberry, I'm a dumpling, I'm a mango. The fact of the matter is there isn't much truth value to either of those particular sort of statements, right? And I think it's really important to sort of think about that, because I'm a failure is a very black and white sort of way of thinking. It's not really sort of considering your successes or your degrees of successes, or the fact that just because you have an area of improvement doesn't necessarily mean that you're a failure, right? So it really doesn't have much truth value, and it's not very sort of refined. Okay. So that thank you mind sort of approach, it loosens up the energy that you're having around that thought. And so you're probably less inclined to want to push it away or avoid it or tackle it, as the security guard part of the brain would want you to do. The other thing that you can try to do is recognize that your thoughts are not going to dictate what you actually end up doing next. So just because you're feeling nervous or you're feeling on edge, it doesn't necessarily mean that you can't act the opposite to that, or dare I say, all the way opposite to that. So just because you're feeling angry, it doesn't mean that you can't act all the way opposite and perhaps sort of take a seat or still speak in an assertive way, for instance. Or just because you're nervous about or anxious about a particular public speaking gig, it doesn't mean that you can't act opposite and present a calm demeanor and say what you actually need to sort of express and get it out, essentially. Or just because you're upset, it doesn't mean that you necessarily need to act on those feelings of being upset. Okay, you can still sort of speak in a calm way to your boss, or ask your boss what you actually sort of need in an assertive and rational sort of way. So you can still act in spite of those thoughts that are coming up for you. The last thing is this idea of let it rain. So it's a mindful way of sort of approaching things. So the R is about recognizing whatever thoughts or emotions that are actually sort of coming up. The A is about allowing yourself to have that particular sort of experience. So recognize or acknowledge, very sort of analogous to sort of recognize and acknowledge the thought that's come in the door. That's similar to sort of recognizing and acknowledging that, a disliked cousin Barney has entered the house, or is at your doorstep, for instance. He's harmless, but you don't particularly like him. You acknowledge him, you allow him into the house, right? And you might sort of accommodate and you let him sort of stay for as long as he needs to, because he's harmless, right? And then you've got the I. So you do so with kindness and compassion. So you take that particular sort of thought that's actually sort of come up for you, for instance, and you investigate it with kindness and compassion. Because if you do it with judgment, then there's a lot of energy around that thought. You're trying to sort of suppress it. But if it's investigated with kindness and compassion, you're in a better position to eventually sort of let it go because the energy around it has loosened up. And then natural awareness. So recognizing, saying to yourself, I'm feeling this. I know I'm feeling this for a particular sort of reason, but I'm not going to allow myself to get caught up with this particular sort of thought. I'm going to act differently, right? So those are some 4 easy tools that you can actually sort of try in dealing with some of that, some of those mental threats that are essentially sort of popping up. So recognizing, hey, this is a security guard part of my brain talking, and I can still act the opposite nevertheless. And one of the key ways in which the hallmarks of that particular sort of technique or underlying themes of all the 4 techniques that are presented is this idea that you can definitely sort of diffuse from these particular sort of thoughts that you're having, because they're not necessarily a reflection of the truth. And the fact that they're not necessarily a reflection of the truth is in the idea, embedded in the idea that you assign meaning to words that you then use to reflect about the context or reflect about everything else. The idea is that you kind of want to take a couple of steps back and diffuse yourself from that and recognize that the security guard part of the brain is currently on overdrive, and it's using an approach to your mental threats in the same way that it would use to physical threats. It's useful for physical threats, but not so much when it comes to our mental threats. And so we need to act opposite and try something different. And these techniques are one way of actually sort of trying something different. Feel free to have a chat with a coach at Uprise to answer any of your questions in relation to this or anything else. But maybe we can have a couple of an opportunity sort of right now to answer sort of any of your questions in relation to what I've spoken about. So we've got a couple of minutes. That's okay, Ada. I hope it was of benefit. Hello, Sholto. Any questions for me? A tricky one, Sholto. Okay, I'll see if I can answer it. So RAIN, so recognize, acknowledge, or allow, investigate with kindness and compassion, and then natural awareness. So natural awareness for the N part. Sholto, I may be able to answer your tricky one. If not, then you can redirect it to another coach at Uprise. That's okay, Jane. The words bring the bad thoughts to us, or bad thoughts translated to bad wordings. Yeah, that's right. So essentially, so those particular words carry specific meanings, and then they start to sort of reflect on the context of what you're actually sort of experiencing. If dealing with a very critical person, what positive thought should one apply? Well, that comes into this idea of this non-judgmental, investigating with kindness and compassion sort of approach. And usually when you're feeling sort of affronted or offended by that particular sort of critical person, a good approach is to sort of act opposite and take on an empathic understanding as to why that individual is experiencing the difficulties in which they're actually sort of experiencing. Okay, so, why are they sort of responding that particular way, generating reasons as to why they're responding in that particular sort of way. I hope that helps. Sholto, you're welcome, everybody. I don't know if we've got any more time. So I found that sometimes I can cool myself when things are spicy. However, the other person I'm involved with can only hear high emotions and don't hear me when I'm cool and I'm calm, but say assertively, but I'm unhappy. Is there something? Yeah, so there's a difference. So sometimes when you feel like that when you sort of express what you need to say, they're only listening when you're actually sort of angry. So that's one of the functions of anger, and perhaps so one of the benefits of anger, and may be useful when you feel like your rights are actually being compromised. And so, but there are sort of different ways of actually sort of articulating your needs and expressing your rights. And that can definitely be done through assertiveness skills training. And that's something that a therapist can actually guide you through, Sholto. So I hope that helps. Too much to be covered essentially in a couple of seconds. Okay. That's okay, Sholto. You're welcome. That's okay, Jess. You're welcome, Jess. Stop repeated memories. You look acknowledge they just keep coming back. No, so usually sort of repeated memories that are sort of unhelpful. One of the things that you could do is some sort of memory restructuring. That's something that you could work with the shrink. Otherwise, what you sort of depends on the nature of the actual sort of memory. But one of the things that you could sort of try is to sort of acknowledge that you're having this particular thought, place it on a leaf and allow it to sort of float by. And it's a leaf down the stream sort of mindfulness exercise. The idea is that when you accept that that thought can come back, you're in a better position to actually sort of let it go eventually. But I think that's all. I think we've passed our sort of 30 minutes sort of time at this particular point. So thank you everybody for joining. Hopefully you'll receive a recording of this and the opportunity to provide feedback as well. All right then. Bye everybody.